Hello, guys. David Vose here. Boy, it's a beautiful day. It really is. I'm just so happy um, with the weather and everything, and everything's going well for me. I hope everything's doing good for you guys, and you're having a wonderful day, guys. I got a lot of stuff to share with you today. That one of those mind blowing videos, I think, and it's going to put a lot of things in place. So let me just get right into it because I know y'all have a lot of time. We don't got forever, right? To sit down there and study all of this information. So let's get right into it. We're going to go into some chronology and the whodunits, and where were they, and who's in Eden? Where is Eden? Right? Is it someplace in heaven, or is it on the earth? And we're not going to get into too much of the shape of the earth and all that today, but I do want to show you some evidence that the Garden of Eden is certainly a beautiful place, somewhere accessible to this world. We're going to give you some information you probably haven't ever really seen before, and talk about Adam and Seth and Enoch and certain individuals. And then we're going to talk about Jesus and Lazarus and John the Baptist and stuff, and how all these people correlate. So let's get started. According to Christians, this is according to AI, they say according to Christian and Jewish traditions, the Garden of Eden still exists but is inaccessible, hidden by deity after Adam and Eve's expulsion, while Scripture doesn't specify its location after the fall. Biblical clues from the four rivers point to a general region in modern-day Mesopotamia or Turkey, though the Great Flood may have obscured the original geography. You see, if the flood was all over the world, and as I believe, the mountain that pushed up wasn't a mountain called Ararat in Turkey, but that word Ararat is the Hebrew word Eret that means earth. And the mound of the earth then rose up from the sea. Now you can imagine it another way. There have been glacial periods. There have been thaws where the water from the ice would melt, and then the water in the ocean would raise and flood over the land, and everything would be destroyed, muddy, or there would be torrential rains because of the fact that there's so much water that, and of course, since the ice is melted, there must be warmer. There's a warming trend, and then this sucks the water up, and then it starts raining and torrential floods, and we go through a long period where very few people can even exist on the earth. Noah then gets in a boat and lands at the top, where the first place pushed up, the mound or the mountain of earth, the first part of the earth pushed up through the mire and landed his boat. And that today, the way the earth is, the center of the land masses of the world is there at Heliopolis. That's the center, the city of On, or the city of Anu, or the city in our Bible called Noah. Anu, Noah. Remember, Hebrew's from right to left, English from left to right. So some languages are upside down or backwards or left to right or right to left. But Noah, N-O, in many translations, No, N-O, not Noah with an H. That's kind of a Hebrew, because the Yiddish Jews, the Jewish people went up north and began to put a on the end, and it was like Noah, and instead of Ra'el, it's Rachel. And the Egyptians had Ra. Well, the Hebrews have Ruach or Rock. But it's just, different pronunciations. So it's easy then to think, well, let's go find this river, Euphrates, Gihon, which is now the Nile, Tigris, and figure out where the Garden of Eden is. Of course, the Garden of Eden is hidden, and it was long before the days of Noah, and in the days of Noah, the whole earth was inundated with water. Now, if you look in the book of Psalms, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and different places, you see that the earth, the mountains were pushed up because of the great flood, and the windows of heaven and the great deep opened, both from beneath and from above, and it says the water covered all the mountains. So we can't then believe that any of these rivers that were named certain names after the flood were the original rivers. They certainly were named after a different place that existed before. So there are traditional views. Many church fathers and traditions teach that Eden was a great, real place, but it's now spiritually hidden and guarded by a flaming sword to prevent humans from re-entering. Some traditions suggest the garden now serves as a holding place for righteous individuals like Enoch and Elijah, who await the second coming of Christ. Isn't that interesting? Because as we've said, the book of Enoch says that Enoch is the Son of Man who will return as the Messiah. Therefore, Enoch is Jesus. And of course, Jesus sits at our Father's right hand, right? On Mount Zion, in the great city that we see in Revelation 21, which is what? It was built by Christ. He says, I go to prepare a place for you in my Father's house. But now, why would Elijah be there? Right? We know why Enoch would be there. He's the Messiah. He died and he went there. He was caught up into heaven, and he was hidden by the clouds from their sight, and he'll return in the same manner as we saw yesterday. So Enoch is there because Enoch was taken and never died, but then he incarnated again as Jesus, and now he's with the Father in paradise. But wait a minute. If Jesus, or we'll say Enoch, was taken and went to his father, appeared before his father's throne, and went to heaven, the stories are in the Sumerian, Babylonian. In the Sumerian tablets, it literally tells us that Adam went to Anu's throne and Enlil, and they offered him the tree of life. Now, how could that be in our Bible, since Adam dies? Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden. So how in the world could there be anybody in Eden or wherever this third heaven is, this paradisical glory? If Adam's been thrown out and Eve was thrown out, where did Enoch go? And who's this person that is sitting in the garden as the father? Well, remember, when Enoch was born, Adam had already just died. Isn't that interesting? So as soon as Adam goes, immediately here comes Enoch. Probably because their firstborn son needed to be with them. And so there was only this one cycle. It says that Enoch lived 365 years and he died. So that's a whole complete revolution. And it obviously is some kind of esoteric story. However, the Bible does make it plain that when Enoch died, there would have been Adam and Eve, because they already passed away just a little short time before Enoch. Now, this is interesting here because for a period of time, I was trying to synchronize Noah, since he seems to be the father, Anu seems to be pretty high up deity. And And the Egyptian pantheons, we talked about that the other day. There's the Og Dog and the Ennead. Now, the Ennead starts with Atum, so that's Adam. But then the Og Dog, which is later, is ruled over by this guy named Nu or Anu. So it's interesting, you might think, well, they probably wouldn't be the same person, right? Anu and Atum, or Noah and Adam, wouldn't be the same person. Although if you go to the chronology, whether it's the Septuagint chronology or the one we have in our Bibles, and if anybody tells you that the King James was translated from the Septuagint or the Textus Receptus, AI will try to tell you that. Tell them they're a liar, because the chronology in our King James and every other Bible we have is from the Masoretic scribes. They got it from the Hebrew text, which was made up after Christ. So we got to go by the Septuagint, which is the only divinely inspired book. But either way, the Masoretic scribes have Noah being born 126 years after Adam dies. But interestingly enough, I think 126 is an odd number, but the Septuagint has Noah being born exactly 700 years after Adam dies. This would allow Enoch 700 years to be with his father Adam and Eve in paradise before Adam would have to come back and return to make an appearance before Noah. And how do I know that Adam has to make an appearance before Noah in Eden or paradise? Aside from the fact that Anu seems to be the chief deity in the Sumerian tablets, not to mention Ra or Aten, but Aten is the same as Atum. But Ra is the spirit that inhabits Atum. So it's the same person as well. Now, I had thought that, and I've mentioned this before, that for a long time I said that Adam and Noah were the same person, just Noah reincarnation of Adam. And I got that because looking at the chronologies, I thought, okay, that makes sense. However, I then thought, well, maybe it was Seth, because Seth also died before Noah was born. And I thought, well, I'm not sure. But, how are we going to be sure? Well, I realize now that we can be sure because the Sumerian tablets has Adapa, which is, of course, our Adam, that was created from the dust. Adapa, Adam. In fact, in our Bible, the earth is called Adamah, and in the Sumerian tablets, you've got an Adamah too, and Adapa. So Adapa was made after Adamah, and that's the earth is Adamah. So the earth was made, and that's feminine, and then Adapa, which is masculine, and that's Adam, and he goes to heaven just to appear before the deity there, which is Anu, Noah. So now we know that the person that's in the garden is not only Adam, but it's also Noah, and he is always called Anu. This is why John is so important, and there's never been born of woman a man greater than John, according to Jesus. And as we've shown from cross-referencing there in the New Testament, John the Baptist was also Lazarus, who was Jesus' father, Jesus being Horus raising up Osiris. So Jesus raising up Lazarus, who is his father, and therefore, depending on the word meaning adelphos, which could mean someone from the same womb, and in some contexts could just mean a relative. So we're not absolutely sure if Jesus married his half-sister Mary Magdalene or his aunt, which would have been the sister of Lazarus. So we know that John, and as we've said, was beheaded as a symbol of the fact that the head of the church, of all authority on earth, they tried to decapitate it. And so all the capitals are decapitations, and they are not the true authority from John, who is actually, this is crazy here, because he's Seth and also Noah. But Seth would be second in charge from Adam because he's the firstborn son, right? However, Abel was firstborn son, and Abel comes back as Enoch. So the seventh in line from Adam is Enoch, and also Abel, who is actually before Seth. So Jesus is actually greater than his own father in this scenario on earth, John, who is a father figure to Jesus when he was in the earth in the first century. But Adam was before that, and he is higher than Noah. And Adam is made in the image of Elohim, or is the form for the father of the Elohim, which is El. So Adam is deity, who is also the deity of this earth, who is the Ancient of Days that the Son of Man shall gain access to. Now remember, the Son of Man in the book of Enoch is Enoch, and Enoch himself did gain access to his father when he went and appeared before Anu. Now, it doesn't say in our Bible that Enoch appeared before Anu, but in the Sumerian tablets, there are two individuals that end up going to heaven and appearing before Anu. Well, there are three, and in a different sense, but two. One is Adapa, which would be Adam, and Adam appeared before Noah. Now, if Adam is Noah, how could Adam appear before Noah? This may then indicate that Noah is not Adam, but the guy that took over after Adam dies, which would have been his son Seth. That fits with what the prophet Joseph Smith said, that the Michael, the archangel, and is Adam, and Gabriel is second in command, and that is Seth. And also later Noah, who is also the archangel Gabriel. We would probably have to say that's correct, since Adam appears before Anu, and therefore Seth is the second in command under Adam, or the archangel Gabriel. However, whether or not he's above Jesus or not, because Jesus is Enoch and also Abel, who would be above Noah. There's a little fuzz there that we're not quite sure how that all works. The seventh in line from Adam is Enoch. So Seth, then, is still there in the garden, or at least in a position of authority. And so when Adam finally dies, he would have appeared before Seth, which is Noah. And of course, in the Septuagint chronology, Seth lived 212 years after Adam died. So if Adam then dies and is taken to someone that's in charge, it wouldn't have been Adam, because he is Adam. It would have been his son, who was there for 212 years. So Seth is Noah, and we would have to say, there's another reason why we'd have to say that Seth is John the Baptist, and Noah, because Jesus said John the Baptist was the greatest that was ever born of a woman. So Seth was born of a woman, his mother, Eve. Adam was not born of a woman, you see. Very interesting. Because James, it says, heaven and earth came into being for James. And, heaven and earth seem to have came into being for Adam. So perhaps James was Jesus's father. But, okay, we've said that John was Jesus's father. Well, if John is Adam, then John is everybody's father, including Jesus. And that's why Jesus said, the Father is greater than I am. And he also says, nobody born of woman greater than John. So there was one greater than John who was not born of a woman. Jesus was born of a woman, every time he came into the world, right? Whether he was Abel or Enoch or Jesus. And John was born of a woman, John the Baptist, and so was Seth. He was born of his mother, Eve. But James, heaven and earth came into being for him. He was also Jesus' father. John was Jesus' father, but John's father was James. James is not his name. In the Bible, his name is Jacob. And certainly Jacob is the symbol of the father of all of the world, just as Abraham and others were. But Jacob is certainly a father type. And since James, heaven and earth came into being for James, James has got to be the father, Adam, who was on the earth right there and was in control of the Heliopolis church after Jesus and after John. And by the way, if you look on your screen, there's the Aurora Borealis. It looks an awful lot like swords or lightning swords that are twirling every which way around and around to guard the way to the tree of life, which is in Eden. Yeah, pretty for situation, the glory of all the earth, in the most extreme ends beyond the poles in the north, according to Psalm chapter 48. So Eden is beyond that swirling cherubim that's swirling not only the astrological wheel that goes around and around, but it seems to right there in the center have this green swirling swords that swirl around, like it says in the Bible. Isn't that interesting? That's guarding the way to the tree of life. But anyway, first there was John of the Zadokite line that was the high priest at Heliopolis, the king priest. And after John, the records say there is a Jason, which would be, just syntax, it would be Isu. And then there is, if you look in the genealogies to Jesus from Adam in Matthew chapter 1, first couple of verses there, starts right off. And it says that Jesus' father was Joseph. We all know that. And Joseph's father was Jacob. AI says the Oniad line of high priests, who were the legitimate Zadokite heirs, went through the following succession in Jerusalem. Onias 3. Remember, Onias is how the Greek New Testament spells John's name, right? Onias. It's just with certain syntax. Sometimes the syntax is different, but that's John. And you'll probably see that they say that was 175 BCE. That's much too early for John the Baptist, right? Not necessarily, because there's discrepancy in the dating. Because this is when the calendar changed, the Julian calendar, in 46 BC. And we do not know how to date all these other things that were going on at that time to synchronize it with the new Julian calendar. So they are actually wrong in much of the dating, but that's a story for another video. And then Jason. And then Menelaus, another individual, possibly related, who outbid Jason, became the high priest. And remember, there's no J, they're just saying Jason. It's Yasun. We showed the other day that with the syntax, Isu could be Isun or Isus or Isu, or different spellings depending on the vocative, the nominative, the dative, and so forth. But who is this Menelaus? Well, there's debate as to whether he was even a Zadokite priest. Some say he was a Levite, and he didn't qualify as a Zadokite priest. But he also went by the name On or John, according to some historical references. But he had a brother named Simon or Simeon, which is interesting because Jesus had a brother named Simeon, and Menelaus is probably just a title, which means the power of the people. Like he was going by that title, and so he may have been or was known as the one who was the person who spoke for the people. He may have also had the name John, but his brother was named Simeon. So we know that Jesus had a brother named Simeon and another named Jude. We don't know if this was Jesus's brother. However, he was the possibly the high priest, at least tentatively, once this Menelaus died, because if that was his brother, he probably took over. And that's kind of what we see when Jesus left. We have Jacob or James, and then we have Jude and Simeon that evidently was high priest at Heliopolis after. So it sort of matches up. But take a look at this. If you want to know this actual chronology or priest list, instead of just getting it from AI and hearsay or Josephus or what he said, let's just go right to Matthew chapter 1 and see who is Jesus' father and his grandfather. Because since these are what we're looking for Jesus' father. Who is he? Well, let's find out. What about Jacob? Well, Matthew chapter 1, it gives the genealogy down to Christ. Verse 15, Eliud begot Eleazar. Okay, Eleazar. And as we pointed out, that is the Hebrew spelling of Lazarus. So that's El-Izar instead of La-Izar. And the Izar and the Ozar is Osiris, but it's the Osiris. So it's the lineal descendant of Osiris, the priesthood of the Zadokite line. So there you go. There's Lazarus, who could be the same Lazarus that Jesus rose from the dead, but it may just be a title of the priesthood there. Because then we go further to Nathan, and Eleazar begot Nathan, and Nathan begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary. So Jacob was Joseph's father. Joseph was Jesus's father, and Joseph is simply a title. See, he's playing the line of Joseph, the firstborn, the heir of Rael. But that would have been the Zadokite priesthood then, not the other Judah priesthood. He otherwise his father's would have been playing a Judah. So it tells us that his name is Joseph, but we never hear of him again. Of course, that is Lazarus, who is also, like Eleazar before him, called Lazarus. But Joseph's father was Jacob. Jacob is how we call James in the New Testament. Now, why does James then end up taking over after Jesus and John are both gone? Well, because Jacob was in charge before John, you see. And then, they serve in succession. And John served for a while and then died. Jesus raised him, but he was no longer the high priest. And then Jesus was temporarily the high priest, but not for very long. After Jesus died, then Jacob, being a very, very old man, or James in the Bible, took over again, resumed the seat. This is why the title of the Zadokite priest, because Zadokite means righteous, translated. And so that's why that title is always on James. James the righteous, James the just, because he was the high Zadokite priest, the righteous priest. And that's the one that they're talking about in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The righteous teacher. So even though John was baptizing his son, then Jesus baptized, but after they left, the high priest, a very old, wise teacher of righteousness, resumed the post. More than likely, this is a little speculation, but this is what I think is probably going on. But we can be sure because the Sumerian tablets say Adapa was taken before Anu. Now, while he goes up there before Anu, there's also Enlil. Well, who's Enlil? Well, that's An-El, right? That is An-El, which is our Abel, because, he died right away, and so he'd be right up there in paradise all this time. There's be Abel. Abel is Abi-El. My father is El, because El is Adam. And An-El, or Enlil, must surely be some form of that word Abel. But instead of father, or my father is El, it has to do with heaven and El, something like that. So remember, we saw earlier, we were talking about how the rabbis and people were saying that in this Eden, in early Christianity, they thought that in Eden, it was a place that held certain individuals like Enoch and Elijah. Okay, we know why Enoch would be there. We've discussed that. But why Elijah? Well, Elijah went up on a fiery chariot, right? He's the only other person that left the earth without dying. And then somehow or another he comes back as John the Baptist. But remember what we said a couple of days ago. Jesus said that John the Baptist was Elijah. And the disciples, after John was beheaded, which means that John was the head of the spiritual priesthood, and the beheading of it represented the attempt to get rid of the priesthood. However, Jesus raised him from the dead. So the disciples were saying that John had been raised from the dead. Now, we know this is true because the Bible tells us that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are the three that Jesus loved. And Mary he loved so much, he kissed her often upon the lips and called her his companion. And we see that Jesus was actually married to Mary Magdalene in John chapter 2, where it states that Jesus' mother was the one in charge of the wedding, and that Jesus was the bridegroom. It literally says that Jesus is the bridegroom, and the governor of the feast that was taking orders from Jesus' mother, he said to the bridegroom, "Why have you brought the good wine out last?" You see, we know that the governor of the feast, speaking to the bridegroom, doesn't say he spoke to Jesus, says he asked the bridegroom, "Why have you brought this good wine out last?" Well, the story tells you that Jesus is the one who brought the good wine out and changed the water into wine. So that is telling you that the bridegroom is Jesus right there, and there's no question about that. Besides, why would there be a wedding in Cana, right? The woman at the well was the Canaanite. He marries her, Mary Magdalene. So why would this wedding be in the Bible? It's the story of Jesus the bridegroom and the great wedding, of course. Most bridegrooms, they put the good wine out first, right? And then after they're all drunk, they drink the other wine. But Jesus made some better wine. Now, what does better wine mean? Stronger? No, it was not wine, but it was hallucinatory. It was the sacrament. And this is a symbolic story of the sacrament and the great wedding of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. This is exactly what this Dionysus, the temple of Dionysus up in Syria, not far from Cana. We don't even know where Cana was, but it's a word that we've confirmed it with AI. This has to do with a city in the Canaanite country. And so you put that together with the fact that Elijah raised up the widow's son. Elisha also did that. And so did Jesus, the widow Nain. He raised up her son. This is the priesthood then from that place up there in Cana. And so that temple of Dionysus is really, in the Hebrew, it's the word Elisha. So we had Elijah and Elisha. Well, Elisha is El, which is the Greek dia, and then the Y is syntax, Dion, and then Isa, which is Jesus, as we pointed out emphatically in yesterday's video. So Dionysus is the same as Elisha. Elisha went there after Elijah got rid of Baalbek, or the religion of Baal up in that area, and created the temple of Dionysa, which is the turning of the water into wine, or the serving of the sacrament, or the exact same thing that Christians were doing. They had the glossolalia, they had the love feasts, they had the sacrament, and they were prophesying and doing all the things that Christians were doing, because this is Christianity, which actually began at Heliopolis with the Serapis Christ and the crossbuns and all this stuff, but it was a worldwide teaching, mystery schools. They were schools all over the place. And these were schools. Each one had a different temple or school. So right after that, John is beheaded, and it says that Lazarus dies. And Lazarus is not a name. Lazarus, we've shown in several videos that this word, spelled differently depending on whether it's in the Latin or the Hebrew or the Greek or other languages. It's the same word Osiris that has come down as Caesar, as Khazar, as Tsar, Cyrus of the Persians, and the Hebrews called this person Eleazar, which is El-Azar, or the Osiris. Now in the Latin we have Lazarus, which is La-Osiris, Osiris. So it just meant the high priest. We know from various ways that this Lazarus was a priest, because Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is the identical story that we find in the Egyptian mythology about Osiris. And of course, Osiris died and Horus raised him from the dead. So Jesus, being a likeness of Horus, raises Osiris from the dead. Now, we know that when Lazarus died, it says that Jesus wept when they told him he died. He was weeping. But that's not all, because then they said, as they marveled, look how this man loved him. He's weeping for him. He loved him. And we also know that Lazarus had two daughters, Mary and Martha. And we're just not sure if they're daughters or sisters. And the Bible tells us that there was a disciple whom Jesus loved. That would be a man, and that was Lazarus, as we've just seen. And it says that he loved Mary and Martha. It says that in our Bible. Now, the book of John is written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. His name is John, but it is Lazarus. And therefore, it is Lazarus in the last chapter of the book of John that Jesus says will remain until I come. If he will remain, then he will not die. Not ever, because he didn't say that. We don't know if he will or will not ever die. But Jesus confirmed that Lazarus or John would be alive at the second coming. Therefore, it's interesting that Enoch and Elijah are there in paradise or in Eden. The book of Genesis describes a river that flowed out of Eden, and it then branched into 4 rivers: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So, because of that, people think then that maybe the Garden of Eden is somewhere, maybe in the Gulf of Aden, right? No, that was named after Eden, somewhere in Syria or Turkey or Palestine or Egypt or somewhere else. But those are locations after the Great Flood. So, as you can see, there are certainly, for such a long time, we had these ancient maps, and they always have these apparent land masses at the North Pole. There's even a Mount Zion that's supposed to be some kind of a magnetic or whatever. And we already saw the Aurora Borealis, what appears to be guarding the way to the Tree of Life. Some traditions have it being a rainbow bridge or something. But it's just something that is permeating all societies and ancient nations, their mythologies, their histories, which I think they're really histories. They wrote them in mythologies or parables to give us the entire legend, as easily and as simply as possible so that we could preserve it. But there is definitely a Shambhala, an Agartha, a Sri Lanka or something. A Mount Zion, the Bible says. Pretty for situation, the glory of all the earth. She's got towers and bulwarks and go around it and, the nations are going to be surprised when they see it. But you say, well, don't you think we would know about that if there was something up there? Well, maybe our government knows and they're not telling us. I don't know. Maybe they actually don't know. Because maybe they actually think that if they went that way, they'd go to Russia, and they don't want to go into communist territory. I don't know what's going on. They haven't been into space. They're lying about that. So they probably haven't even gone, because it could be way past the North Pole. It could be a land beyond the North Pole. We only know that it's supposed to be in the north. And all the mythologies and histories tell us this. What most Christians don't know is how jam-packed the Bible is with all of these verses talking about this glorious Mount Zion. We know about a lot of these verses, but we're like, oh, well, that's mythological, or that's funny, or isn't that sweet, right? This mountain in the north. Well, Isaiah 14 talks about the mountain, and it literally talks about it in the same manner in which the Ugaritic texts talk about this mountain, the mountain of El, they call it, and he's got two sons that are fighting. It's the same story. And so we got the Canaanites, we've got the Hebrews, we've got the Greeks, we've got everybody, Mount Olympus. Friends, this is established. And then you got to say, well, okay, do you believe in the scriptures? Do you believe in the great temple and what it says? Do you believe that Plato, or, well, Pythagoras and individuals like that went down and learned from the Egyptian priests about all this history? Do you believe any of this? How could they all be consistently telling the same story? And the odd thing about it is everything that the Bible says about it, it seems to be exactly the way it is. Exactly the way it is. So, you know what? I'm going to leave it here today because I want to devote an entire video on some of these verses in the Bible. And we're going to literally show you some things that will completely blow your mind if it hasn't already been blown. I needed to do this video to show you the consistency that we have from all the chronologies, all the king lists, patriarch lists, god lists. They're not gods, Olympian lists, or whatever. The Anunnakis, or whatever people call these immortal ones. We have the Highlanders that are spoken of, the legends. What are the Highlanders that live thousands of years? And what are all these stories? What is the story of Superman? I know it's a story, it's a movie, but where are we getting all of this information? It seems like the battle between Batman, the bloodsucker, and Superman that, is from his father El, right? His father, Superman's father's El. Look, it's all not just some made up baloney. We're really here, guys. There's a reason, there's a purpose for why we're all here, and what we're doing here is so important. And I think it's important that we understand. And we need to, look at the scriptures, because they will tell us about these things and give us hope. And the Apostle Paul says they are written as a warning, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So this is the end of the age. No, the world's not going to perish. The Bible says that the earth was made, created to be inhabited. It is established, and it will be inhabited forever. You see, Elohim made this world, Genesis chapter 1. The purpose of this universe that we manifest is so that we can experience and learn. And so in the temples, they wrote all this information down for us. The names of our Father, it's written in our Bibles, but modern folks today, they don't really believe anything that the Bible says. It's all esoteric, Dave. But here's the thing. So many people who believe in this esoteric wisdom, and they say all is spiritual, They always say this little quote, that was probably something that Hermes Trismegistus said, which is a Greek way of saying Thoth, which is Jesus or Enoch. And they always say, as above, so below. And they're loving that saying. They always say, I don't care if it's Santos, Bonacci, he uses that expression, Joshua of the sons of God, they all say it. And yet they only believe in the above. You see, it's as above, so below. You see, everything that is spiritual is also physical. The great truth that has been overlooked and misunderstood by many seekers after the truth for thousands of years, many have missed the mark. They have misunderstood. This is why you've got Christianity, the apostles, and then you had those that would veer off into some crazy idea. Apostasy. We are individuals, the children of the living deity. And paradise was made for you and me. That's the song, I think. Was made for you and me, right? And what would you want out of life? What would be the point of living? Eternal joy. Because the prophet Joseph Smith said, happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue that path that leads to it. Unquote. And he also said that pursuit of happiness or eternal joy is the fundamental purpose of life. He said that Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. He taught that we cannot achieve eternal joy that our Heavenly Father experiences unless we also possess a glorified, resurrected, physical body. And he said that the elements are eternal and that in the beginning, the Elohim instructed and said that the spirit and element, inseparably connected, receive a fullness of joy. And when separated, man cannot receive a fullness of joy. So we have to come to the world, get our bodies so that we can experience the fullness of joy. And through bodies, we have this beautiful thing we call the Arios Gamos, which is the purpose of life. We leave our father and mother, and we stick into our wife, and we will raise up children, because for all eternity, we'll be bringing up multitudes of beautiful children and having this association, this joy of teaching and watching our children grow and experience all the things that we have done, you see. He said, as man now is, deity once was. As deity now is, man may be. And that is the most beautiful truth that you will ever hear. We're not going to sit in a corner and go, and blank out our mind and go into some nirvana, whatever that is. You see, and we're not going to live in a perpetual, wicked, evil world. But we're going to advance and get our white robes and our crowns. Dear friends, I'm going to go ahead and go and leave it there. Get this uploaded. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. You know the Lord loves every one of you. His grace and His peace will be with you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.